Let me see. Let me see if I got all my eggs in the basket here, so to speak. Yep, we are live. Just 1 second, everybody. Test my audio real quick. Audio is good, so ignore the echo if anybody is here. Oh, poop. Get out of full screen. Full screen is gross. Let me get rid of comments on my iPad so that way it doesn't look gross. I usually look over at my laptop for comments and stuff. 1 second, we'll get the show rolling, everybody. Just having to share this around in a few little groups. Alright. Hi, Discord here. Plug you up. Crack open a can of the good shit. Oh. Yeah, there we go. I'm glad it finally went live. I had like problems trying to get it to go live. It's being a right pain in the keister tonight. You know what? Fuck the heat. I'm gonna grab my jacket. There we go. All nice and cozy. That's what we strive for here. We just want to get all nice and cozy. Okay, let's fix my camera a little bit. Okay. 1 second. Alright. Yeah. Hi, everybody. You know, I was debating whether I should do In the Mouth of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft, which I have read before, or if I should start The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which I have not read before. I figured it'd be a safer bet going with the book I've already read, trying to read it live on stream. But you never know. It's just like a hard choice. But yeah, we'll just go Shadow over Innsmouth. It's what I've advertised. People may dig it. You never know. But yeah, tonight, Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. Innsmouth. It's like the way you say it's kind of up for interpretation there. Most of the words in H.P. Lovecraft stories have like really hard pronunciations because they're supposed to like signify madness. That just reading or pronouncing half of these eldritch abominations that he puts in his stories is supposed to make you go mad because our human brains can't quite comprehend what's on the page, and the characters in the stories, they can't comprehend what's happening to them in the story themselves. But last week on the channel, I read 2 stories by H.P. Lovecraft. Pickman's Model, which was the story of a painter who painted very horrible things in his basement, which isn't very far off from Dorian Gray, which would have been my other choice tonight. But he painted horrible things and based them off monsters that he took photos of in the streets of Boston, because, of course, Boston is the place you go to see all kinds of abominations at 1920s America. And I also read The Music of Eric Zahn, which was about a musician who kind of faded in with the blackness of night and played music that was enough to like haunt his neighbor below him. It was like a mesmerizing haunting where he was afraid of it, where the chords of the music was not like he's never heard anything like it compared to around the time we would have just had like classical pieces being played, like Beethoven and Bach. And it's like that was what trained musicians are like trained in. But this guy was playing strange melodies that were foreign, and eventually the darkness took over and kind of sucked his life away. Both of these, while dark and monster stories, weren't quite cosmic horror. Music of Eric Zahn were more leaning towards cosmic horror due to like its ending, but even then it was never in the mythos that like H.P. Lovecraft set up. H.P. Lovecraft set up what everybody would know as the Cthulhu mythos. It's like was also tempted to read the Call of Cthulhu tonight. You know, since we are doing like Cthulhu is shorter, and I can read Shadow over Innsmouth late. You know what, chat? You know what? Fuck it. Fuck it. We're reading Call of Cthulhu. Hang on. It's shorter, and it's like a good, perfect introduction to the Cthulhu mythos, because it is, of course, Cthulhu mythos. Reading The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. There we go. Updated the title. Let me see if it sticks. Yeah, there it is. Hey, Inuyasha, how are you tonight, friend? Oh, thanks for popping in. Like I said, I'm going to be reading a book. I had fun with it last week. Like, it's easy on my hands, because I don't know if he was around when I was, like, whining about it on stream. But I've got, like, a lot of really bad carpal tunnel in my hand, and it's so much of a pain in the butt to deal with. And, like, just playing games for, like, more than 2 hours is usually enough to, like, send my hands, like, this pulsating pain, and I hate it. I did security work for, like, 2 years, and all I did nonstop every night was just drive on, like, the bumpiest, most horrid roads you could ever, like, take a car across. B-Cops just subscribed. Hey, bud. How are you? How are you? How are you? How are you, Inuyasha? That's the question. How have you been? Travioli, read me the bookioli. Yeah, B-Cops. I was going to go with the Mount of The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft, but I think I changed my mind. We're going to be doing The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft, which is a perfect introduction to the Cthulhu mythos. And it's not as long, so I might be able to finish it in like one session versus 2 or 3. But yeah, thank you for resubbing, friend. It means a lot. It's like I'll try to I know I've said it for a month, but I'll try to get some emotes soon. Yeah, I remember having trouble to play a game with the glove on. Yeah, it's like those are my copper fit gloves, so they kind of help a little bit. Like you gotta wear them like a long time to feel like any benefit off of them. I'm not gonna wear them tonight since I'm already wearing like my nice jacket. But yeah. But all right, everybody, The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Let me take a quick little sip before we get this show on the road. But yeah, Cops, Inuyasha, thanks for popping in, friends. And I hope you enjoy a late night scary bedtime story. The Call of Cthulhu, found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. Of such great powers or beings there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 1. The Horror in Clay. Yo, Poop Daddy is in here. Hey there, Murph. How are you? Changed my mind on reading Shadow over Innsmouth, and we're just starting The Call of Cthulhu, which is the signature H.P. Lovecraft horror story. So buckle in, Poop Daddy, because we got us a treat coming. All right, Chapter 1. The Horror in Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But some day the piercing together of disassociated knowledge will open up of a terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation, or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. The Osophists, bad big word, have guessed at the gruesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle, where in our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of the forbidden aeons which chills me when I think of it, and maddens me when I dreamt of it. The glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piercing together of separated things. In this case an old newspaper item, and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to 27. With the deaths of my grand uncle, George Gamel Agnel, professor of Emeritus of Semitic Languages at Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Agnel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions, and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of the prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of his death. The professor had been stricken while returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having jolted by a nautical-looking man. It's not nautical-looking man. It's like a way more culturally insensitive term, but I'm going to skip over those for the sake of not getting in trouble on Twitch and how kind of bad they are. The 1920s were a different time, folks, and while Lovecraft was a troubled man, I thought his writing has stood the test of time through the 100 years. And I think that's what's important. Like Edgar Allan Poe, he was, pardon my French, a piece of shit in many ways, but his art itself was one of my favorites. So, little bits I have to skip over, I'll skip over, but you get the gist. A nautical-looking man who had come from one of the queer, dark courts on the precipitous hillside, which forms a short-cut from the waterfront to the deceased home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded, after perplexed debate, that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my grand-uncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston, much of which the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society. But there would be one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from shewing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring, which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, but when I did, so seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the queer clay bas relief and the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle, in his later years, become credulous of the most superficial impostors? I resolved to search out the most eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bas relief was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from the modern in atmosphere, and suggestions for although the vagaries of Cubanism and Futurism are many and wild, they did not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. And writing of some kind, the bulk of these designs seems certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even hint at its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its future. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a humanoid caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacle-headed surmounted a grotesque and scaly body, with the rudimentary wings, but it was the grotesque outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion that the Cyclopean architecture background. Ooh. Take me a quick hydrate real quick. This stuff's rough on your throat, folks. Oh. Okay. The writing accompanying this oddity was aside from a stack of press cuttings in Professor Agnell's most recent hand, and made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, and characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925 Dream and Dream Work by H. A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas St. Providence, Rhode Island, and the second Narrative of Inspector John R. LeGrasse, 121 Benville Street, New Orleans, Los Angeles, at 1908 AAS. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from the theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, and the rest comments on long-surviving secrets, societies, and hidden cults, which references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to auto-mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. B-Cop's Redeemed Hydrate Boy. Thanks, man. Could use that. Oh. I've also got water, so not just soda. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Agnell, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightingly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design, and living alone in the Fleur de Lis building near the institution. Wilcox was a precarious youth of known genius but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself physically hypersensitive, but the staid folk of ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility, and had now known to a small group of athletes from other town. Even the Providence of Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. Doesn't sound like Dr. Wilcox is much of a good guy. On the occasion of the visit, ran the professor's manuscript, The sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics of the bas-relief. He spoke in dreamy, stilted manner which suggested posed and alienated sympathy, and my uncle shewed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was a fantastic poetic cast which must have typified the whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new, indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or the garden-girdled Babylon." It was then that he began the rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor, and the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror, hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy would transmutate into sound, but he attempted to render the most unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fatagan. The gerbil jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Agnell. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness, and studied, with almost frantic intensity, the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working. Chilled and clad only in his night clothes, when waking had stolen bewilderingly over him, my uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those who tried to connect the latter with strange cults and societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Agnell became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterranean voice of intelligence, shouting monstrously in enigmatical sense impacts and unscriptable save as gibberish, the two sounds most frequently repeated on those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Railia. On March 23rd, my father's birthday, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alternations of an unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from this time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's ferbile mind, apparently, was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what had formerly dreamed, and had touched wildly on a gigantic thing miles high, this object, but occasional which walked or lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasional frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence unto lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than a mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home, completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Agnell he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle had kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly unusual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but the references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought, so much, in fact, that only the ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period that in which young Wilcox had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams, and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than an ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. His original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and a really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formlessly nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. The scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in 1 case there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that the panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. In this way I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of this old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from athletes told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreamers confessed acute fears of a gigantic nameless thing visible towards the last. 1 case, which it notably describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a widely known as architect with leanings towards theosophy and occultism, which went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure, and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questions felt as puzzling as did the fraction. It was well that no explanation should ever reach them. The press cuttings, if I have imitated, touch on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Agnell must have employed the cutting bureau, for the number of extracts is tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaned from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophic colonies as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment. which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest towards the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Lebanites on the night of March 22nd to 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ardoy Bonal hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the records, troubles, in insane asylums, that only a miracle could have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, and I can at this date scaringly envision all the callous rationalism for which I had set them aside, but I was then convinced yet young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. End of chapter 1. Whew, this is a mouthful, folks. How you liking it, cops? Spooky story, lots of big words. Hard to read, but it's a challenge regardless. Pacha. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, bud. This next chapter is, this book starts slow. Like, where it's just, the scientist looking through his uncle's letters and finding all kinds of crazy things and dreams of people with like astute minds. But later on, it shifts protagonists throughout the story as he looks through all his uncle's notes. And let me tell you, cops, it gets batshit crazy. It's a nice listen. I appreciate it, my man. I hope it's I know this is usually around the time you get ready and wind down for bed. So, glad to be of service of a bedtime story. You know, I'll drink a little bit of water. Soda's kind of clogging my throat. Okay. I made this mistake last stream, drinking Powerade. Okay. Chapter 2. The Tale of Inspector Legrasse. The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream and bas-reliefs so significant to my uncle formed the subject of the second half of the long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Agnell had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard the ominous symbols which can only be rendered as Cthulhu, and all this, and so stirring and horrible a connection that is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meetings in St. Louis. Professor Agnell, so befitted one of his authority and attainments, had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. Oh, excuse me. B-Cops tucks himself in. Get you some warm milk. The chief of these outsiders, in a short time, the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking, middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for a certain special information, unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and was by profession an inspector of police, which him he bore the subject of his visit. A grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette, whose origin he was at a loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by the purely professional considerations. The statuette before the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on the supposed voodoo meeting, and so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it, that the police could not but realize they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolical than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered. Hence the anxiety of the police for the antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and though it tracks down the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze to the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity hinted no potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object. Yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed down from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisite artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and fore feet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural elegancy, was of somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with uncipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block, and the seat occupied the center, whilst the long carved claws of the doubled-up, crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down towards the bottom of the pedestal. The cephaloid head was bent forward, so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of the huge forepaws which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and was more subtly fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable, yet not one link did it shew with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, for the soapy, greenish-black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. These characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation, or half the world's experts leading in its field, could form the least notion or even the remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject of material, belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life, which our world and our conceptions have no part. Travioli for Audible. I'd be down to do it. I don't know if I'm technically qualified. I've never even done a bit of acting in my life, but I try my best. I hope it's entertaining at least. I'm having fun doing it. I've always been better at, I don't know if it's like a type of undiagnosed ADD or what, but I always concentrate better on books when I read them aloud. It's if I'm reading them to, in my head, I always, circle around and try to, and just lose my thought. It's never been, super easy. But reading aloud, it just, paints a better picture, Okay. And yet, as the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told the diffidence and the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Esquimaux, whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with a deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith which other Esquimaux, I don't know how to pronounce that word, Esquimaux, I think that's it, M-A-U-X, but yeah, that's how we'll go with it, knew little, and they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come down from horribly ancient aeons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil, or Tusanok, or Tunasuk. Yeah, Tunasuk is it. Yeah, the words get a little bit funky later on in this. And the Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged Angakok, or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just how of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they had danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs? It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing, and so far as he could tell, it was a rough enough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. Kronk. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legras, and he began to at once ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember the best he might the symbols taken down amongst the diabolus Esquimaux. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really awed silence, for which both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. What, in substance, both the Esquimaux wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very much like this, the word divisions being guessed at form traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud. Frungli, Muglaf, Cthulhu Railia, Wengal Nal Fatagan. Legras at one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him that older elephants had told him the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Railia dead, Cthulhu waits, dreaming. And now, in response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legras related, as fully as possible, his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It is savored in the wildest dreams of myth-maker and theosophist, in an undisclosed and astonishing degree of cosmic imaginations among half-castes and pariahs as might be expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to the New Orleans police frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known, and some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the black haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There was an insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants, and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added that people could stand it no more. And so a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide, and at the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed on the silence through the terrible cypress woods, where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dark ink stones or fragment of a rotting wall intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungulous islet combined to create. At length the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbling lanterns. The, the muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at the infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond the endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance another inch towards the scene of unholy worship, so Inspector Legrosse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The religion now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white polypous thing with luminous eyes, and evil squatters worshipped that bat-winged devil flew out from the caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before in D'Iberville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die, but it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was indeed on the marst fringe of the abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrosse's men as they plowed on through the black mosses toward the red glare and muffled tom-toms. There were local qualities peculiar to men, and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one where the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license were whipped themselves by a daemonic heights, by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized ululation would cease, and that what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise and sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. Flunglai, Mrufnaf, Cthulhu, Raiglia, Woglau, Nagel, Fotagan. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legrosse dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting men, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a greasy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any of the Cyme or an Agnolia could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by the occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous with its diminutiveness, rests the noxious cavern statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up the regular intervals, with the flame-girt monolith as center hanging, head down toward, and the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, that the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right, an endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have only been echoes that induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unilluminated spot deeper within the woods of ancient legendary and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint the faint beatings of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a monstrous white bulk beyond the remotest trees, but I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel elephants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes the reluctant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made, but in the end Legrasse was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall in line between the 2 rows of policemen, 5 of which the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legrasse. Okay, I think my stream thing went a bit wonky right there. 1 second, folks. Oh, hey, somebody gifted me a sub to Retro Resurrection. How nice. It's anonymous, too. Love that guy. Super nice. But, back to the story. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of a very low mixed blooded and mentally apparent type. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of people an apparent type of largely West Indians of Bravo Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands. I had to skip over a very bad word right there. A Lovecraft signature, so to speak. So that's up to the imagination. Gave a coloring of voodooism to the hierogenous cult, but before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than the fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. Yeah, he's a very nice dude. It's like I've only been in a few streams. I think I met him last week, but he's very nice. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, who came to the young world out of the sky. These old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. And was this cult and the prisoners had always existed and always would exist, hidden in the distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great priest Cthulhu from his dark house in the mighty city of Rylea under the waters should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Some day he would call, and when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. 1 second. Video editor's things acting fucky. Okay. Meanwhile, no more... Yeah, there it is. No more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but these things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only worshipped. The chant meant only this: in this house, a Rylea dead, Cthulhu waits, dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions, all denied a part in the ritual murders, and averred that the killing had been done by the black-winged ones which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did abstract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of Theosophus and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been aeons which other things ruled the earth, and they had grown great cities, remains of them, he said the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs in the time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come around to the right positions, the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars, and brought their images with them. Okay. The great old ones, Castro continued, were not comprised altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Rylea, preserved by the spells of the mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection, when the stars and the earth might once be ready for them. But at that time some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst unaccounted by millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted through thought. And even now they talked in their tombs, and after infinities of chaos the first men came. The great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Is B rated in? Oh man, I'm missing a lot here. B with the rate is 7. Hey bud, how are you tonight? Thanks for coming in. We're reading The Call of Cthulhu tonight. We're chapter 2 of it. The professor's looking through his notes of his dead uncle, and he's currently reading the case of a police inspector raiding a cult in Louisiana. And he's talking about the great Cthulhu cult that they busted. Mighty Morgo. Juicy J resubbed. I appreciate it. B resubbed. Also appreciate it. Good, dude. We started a Pokemon randomizer and it was unwinnable. How did you beat Psychonauts tonight, or did you just get sick of it tonight? Travioli. Let's go. Appreciate you all coming in. I love it when that happens. I did finish Psychonauts. Don't know what I'll be playing next. Unwinnable in the most hilarious way. Was it as bad as B-Cops' run of Pokemon, where he got destroyed? Everybody got destroyed except my Travioli, of course. Shout out Juicy J. Shout out B.E. Everybody give Cops, can you give Mighty Morgo a shout out too? He's a good friend of mine, and he just started streaming himself. I think he's streaming Kingdom Come Deliverance right now. I don't know if he stopped though. Ah, yes, bedtime story. Thanks, Dad. That's right, Trav Dad. It's gonna read you to sleep. Yeah. He just started streaming a few days ago. I think his first stream was Resident Evil 7. Now he's playing Kingdom Come Deliverance. He's a real good friend of mine, and appreciate if everybody dropped him a follow. But yeah, everybody, thanks for coming in. And back to the horror of the Call of Cthulhu. I'm gonna have to backtrack a little bit because I forgot where I was. First, let me hydrate. Just stop. Thanks, Poop Daddy. No biggie. How'd the rest of the stream go, Morgan? Sorry I couldn't get back in there fast enough. Then whispered Castro, those first men formed the cults around small idols which the great ones shewed them. Idols brought in dim eras from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, for all earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways, and shadowed forth the prophecy of their return. Went good, other than the long pauses during the cutscenes. I haven't played much of Kingdom Come yet, Morgan, but I think I've just got past the opening myself, but I like it a lot, too. In the elder time, chosen men had talked of entombed old ones in dreams, but then something had happened. The great stone city, Rylea, with its monoliths and sculptures, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery, through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse, but memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again, and the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, with full of dim rumors picked up in the caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms, but of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, or Irem, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, which was not virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted at it, though the deathless Chinamen said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they choose, especially the much-discussed couplet. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons, even death may die. I love reading this shit, man. Legros, deeply impressioned by not a little bewildered, and inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities of the Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now detectives have come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused the meeting by Legros's tale, corroborated as it was by the statuette, is echoed by the subsequent correspondence of those who attended, although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the Society. Caution is the first of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. The grass for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, and where I viewed it not long ago, is truly a terrible thing, and is unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculptor, I did not wonder, for what his thoughts might arise upon hearing, after a knowledge of what Legros had learned of the cult, and a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and hieroglyphics of the swamp found in the Greenland Devil Tablet, had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by the Quizmal Diabolus and the mongrel Louisianans. Professor Agnell's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery of my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration, and about the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led to adopt what I thought of the most sensible conclusions. So after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes of the cult narratives of Legros, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculpture and give him the rebuke I thought proper, so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Whew. Doing all right, bud. Got through a crazy work week. Excited for a long weekend. There's a 3rd chapter in this, but I might not make it through it tonight, folks, because my throat is getting fucked. I'm going to build myself up for this a little bit better. I've always liked just rambling on but I've never really gotten a chance to read to this extent to an audience. So the fact that all you folk come in and just listen to me ramble about ancient space gods and bullshit, it means the world to me. This has seriously been the highlight of my week the last few months, just getting to hop on and chat with everybody. So thank you all for being here and sticking around and being good friends. But yeah, on with the chapter. Okay. Wilcox lived alone in the Fleur de Lis building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Boston architecture, which flaunted its stuccoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill, and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded, from the specimens scattered about his genius, was indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay, and will one day mirror and marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose, and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect, he turned unguidedly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing the strange dreams, yet had never explained the reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a sort of time I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake, and of their subconscious residuum had influenced art profoundly, and he shewed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with the potency of its black suggestion. He could not recall having the original of this thing, except in his own dream bas-relief, but those outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was no doubt the giant shape he had raved in delirium, that he really knew nothing in the hidden cults, save from my uncle's relentless catechism he had let fall. He soon made clear, and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness this damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong, and hear with frightened ecstasy the ceaseless, half-mental calling from the underground, "Cthulhu Fhtagn! Cthulhu Fhtagn!" These words had formed part of what dread ritual told of a dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Rylea, and I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had stone subconsciousness expression in dreams, in the bas-relief, and in the terrible statue I now beheld, so that this imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type, and at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably, and wish him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of professional fame from researches into its origin and connections. I visited New Orleans, talked with Legras and others of that old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, and even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically first-hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I was sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion, whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity of the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Agnell. One thing I began to suspect, which I fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading from the ancient waterfront storming with the foreign mongrels. After a careless push from a sailor, I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members of Louisiana, and who would not be surprised to learn of the secret methods and poisoned needles as ruthless and as anciently known as the cryptid rites and beliefs. Legras and his men, it is true, had been let alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things as dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle, after encountering the sculptor's data, I have come to sinister ears. I think Professor Agnell died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now. And that's the end of chapter 2. There is one more chapter. It is titled The Madness from the Sea, and it is one of the most badass chapters in literature. I'm not gonna lie. Let me see how long it is. 1 page, 2 page, 3 pages, 4 pages. You know what? It's like 10 pages. And I don't really want to get back to this tomorrow. But, yeah, give me 5 minutes to, go on a refresher break. And then we will finish the Call of Cthulhu. But before let me see if I can turn my camera off on this thing. I cannot. Well, everybody enjoy the background view of my room. So, be right back, folks. Alright, folks, I have returned. Throw my coat to the side here because it is hot as a witch's tit in here. Wait. Mighty Matt Morgo. Someone just tipped me $30. I'm like, what? Holy shit. Nice. Nice one, Morgan. I love you too, B-Cops. I appreciate the shit out of you, dude. I don't know if you've noticed, but I feel like I've put on a few of your ticks, saying thanks bud all the time, just the way I talk to the audience. See, that's something. Scoot my chair forward a little bit. I've kind of got a little MacGyvered setup here, so It's not the best, but I got like some cool pumpkins behind me, so there's that. Before we go on, my book doesn't have a picture of Cthulhu. Like, it's a really famous sketch that Lovecraft did himself. And while my version might not have a picture of it, I did draw a picture of it. So let me just dig it out here. It was like one of the last things I did, because I haven't drawn in a good while. 1 second, folks. Okay. Yeah, so that's Cthulhu. That's like the statue that the sailors have went real crazy about in the story. It's like real horrid octopus-like face and the stone statue which he sits on. In his house that Riley had dead, Cthulhu waits dreaming. It's been one of my favorite drawings I've done. Yeah, I just wanted to like share that to kind of add a little bit of extra imagery to the story. Ooh. How do you auto-host channels again? I can never figure it out. I'm not sure, Murph. I'm not sure. My girlfriend said it was Mr. Beast. Maybe your girlfriend's just being extra sweet tonight, big guy. Yeah. I'm getting a little tired, and I normally wouldn't force this, but there's not much left to the story. There's like 10 pages. And it's like the most kick-ass part of the whole story. It's the climax. So, of course, we've got to finish it. Take another little sip here. You can add them in the creator dashboard. Murph and Man. Murph's like the only one of us three that's not entirely new to streaming. Okay. Oh. Chapter 3. The Madness from the Sea. If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it will be of total efficing of the results of a mere chance which fixed my eye on a certain stray piece of shelf paper. It was nothing on which I would naturally have stumbled in the course of my daily round, for it was an old number in the Australian Journal, the Sydney Bulletin, for an April 18th, 1925. It had escaped even the cutting bureau which had, at the time of its insurance, been avidly collecting material for my uncle's research. I had largely given over my inquiries into what Professor Agnell called the Cthulhu cult, and was visiting a learned friend in Paterson, New Jersey, the curator of a local museum and a mineralogist of note, examining one day the reserved specimens roughly set on storage shelves in the rear room of the museum. My eye was caught by an odd picture in one of the old papers spread beneath the stones. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned, for my friend has wide affiliations in all conceivable foreign parts, and the picture was of half-cut of a hideous stone image almost identical to what Legras had found in the swamp. Eagerly clearing the sheet of its precious contents, I scanned the item in detail and was disappointed to find of only moderate length. What it suggested, however, was of portentous significance to my flagging quest, and I carefully tore it out for immediate action. I read it as follows. Hey, B-Cops, thanks for the shout-out. Hey, Retro Resurrection, hey, how you doing tonight, friend? I saw where somebody gifted me a subscription to your channel, so thank you. Oop, hang on, let me catch up on chat. What was the reasoning behind the story of Cthulhu? What was Lovecraft's M.O.? Lovecraft was very crazy, and very crazy. So that's the reasoning for it. He's kind of like Edgar Allan Poe in that way. He took like inspiration from Poe of like the grim imagery, and he also took inspiration from a story called The King in Yellow, which I think came in like 1906. So that's... His stories were more independent of each other, but it was like his publisher, after he died, was the one who like started coining the Cthulhu mythos. I hit everyone in chat with a quick follow. You guys are wholesome as hell. Heck yeah, they are, Morgan. I've done good to like find such nice people on here. I've really lucked out. Also, hi. I meant bit, not but LOL. Oh, really? That's news to me, but that's cool. Yeah, I appreciate it. What were you streaming tonight, Retro? Oh, Pokemon Red and Blue. There's that. But yeah, back to the story. Mystery derelict found at sea. Vigilant arrives of helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survivor and dead man found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and deaths at sea. Rescued seaman refuses particular of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow. This Morrison Company freighter, Vigilant, bound from Valparaiso, arrived this morning at its wharf in Darling Harbor, having in tow the battered and disabled but heavily armed steam yacht Alert of Dunedin, NZ, which was sighted on April 12th in south latitude 34:21, west longitude 152 to 17, which one living and one dead man aboard. The Vigilant left Valparaiso on March 25th, 2 days after the man went insane in the story, and on April 2nd was driven considerably south of her course, exceptionally heavy storms and monster waves. On April 12th the derelict was sighted and thoroughly and apparently deserted, was found upon boarding to contain one survivor in a half-delirious condition and one man who had evidently been dead for more than a week. The living man was clutching a horrible stone idol of unknown origin, about a foot in height, regarding whose nature authorities in Sydney University, the Royal Society, and the Museum in College Street all profess complete bafflement, and which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht in a small carved shrine of common pattern. Oh, how long have you been doing these readings? Just a week, Retro. I started last Sunday with like a few short stories by Lovecraft, and tonight we're doing Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft. I'm fresh near the end of it. It's about a professor who's like looking through his uncle's notes and finding all kinds of crazy things that he found. Thanks for the follow, Morgo. Yes, just a week. I'm hoping to get better at it and keep them going a while though, because I do have a lot of fun doing it, and other people have said they've liked them. So that's a good way of kind of mixing up the content from like video games and stuff, you know? Okay, where was I? This man, after recovering from his senses, told an exceedingly strange story of piracy and slaughter. He is Gustaf Johansen, a Norwegian of some intelligence, and has been a second mate of the two-masted schooner of Emma of Auckland, which sailed for Callao on February 20th with a complement of 11 men. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown widely south of her course by a great storm on March 1st and March 22nd. Encountered the Alert, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes, being ordered peremptorily to turn back. Captain Collins refused, whereupon the strange crew began to fire savagely, without warning, upon the schooner with a peculiarly heavy battery of brass cannon, forming part of the yacht's equipment. The Emma's men shewed fight, says the survivor, and through the schooner began to sink from shots beneath the waterline they had managed to heave alongside their enemy and board her. Grappling with the savage crew on the yacht's deck, and being forced to kill them all, a number being slightly superior because of their peculiar abhorrent and desperate though rather clumsy mode of fighting. 3 of Emma's men, including Captain Collins and First Mate Green, were killed, and the remaining 8 under Second Mate Johansen proceeded to navigate the captured yacht, going ahead in their original direction to see if any reason for their ordering back had existed. The next day, it appears, they raised and landed on a small island, though none is known to exist in that part of the ocean, and 6 of the men somehow died ashore, though Johansen is queerly reticent about this part of the story, and speaks only of their falling into a rock chasm. Later, it seems, he and one companion boarded the yacht and tried to manage her, but were beaten about by the storm of April 2nd. From that time till his rescue on the 12th, the man remembers little, and he does not even recall when William Bryden, his companion, died. Bryden's death reveals no apparent cause, and was probably due to excitement or exposure. Cable advices from Dunedin reports that the Alert was well known there as the island trader, but bore an evil reputation along the waterfront. It was owned by a curious group of half-castes whose frequent meetings and night trips to the woods attracted no little curiosity, and it had set sail in great haste after the storm and earth tremors of March 1st. Our Auckland correspondent gives the Emma and her crew an excellent reputation, and Johansen is described as a sober and worthy man. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry on the whole matter beginning tomorrow, and of which every effort will be made to induce Johansen to speak more freely than he has done hitherto. This was all together with a picture of the hellish image, but what a train of ideas it started in my mind! Here there were new treasuries of data on the Cthulhu cult, and evidence that it had strange interests at sea as well as on land. What motive prompted the hybrid crew to order back the Emma as they sailed about with their hideous idol? What was their unknown idol on which 6 of the Emma's crew had died? And what about the mate Johansen was so secretive? What had the Vice Admiralty investigation brought out, and what had known of the noxious cult in Dunedin? And most marvelous of all, what deep and more than natural linkage of dates was this which gave a malign and now undeniable significance to the various turns and events so carefully noted by my uncle. March 1st, or February 28th, according to the international date line, the earthquake and storm had come. From Dunedin, the Alert and her noisome crew had darted eagerly forth, as if imperiously summoned, and on the other side of the earth poets and artists had begun to dream of a strange, dank, cyclopean city, whilst a young sculptor had moulded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulhu. March 23rd, the crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island and left 6 men dead, and on that date the dreams of sensitive men assumed a heightened vividness and darkened with dread of a giant monster's malign pursuit, while an architect had gone mad from the sculptor had lapsed suddenly into delirium. And what of the storm on April 2nd, the date on which all the dreams of the dank city had ceased, and Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of his strange fever? What of all this, and of those hints from old Castro about the sunken, star-born old ones, and their coming reign, their faithful cult, and their mastery of dreams? Was I tottering on the brink of cosmic horror beyond man's power to bear? If so, they must be horrors of the mind alone, for in some way the 2nd of April they had put stop to whatever monstrous menace had begun in siege of mankind's soul. That evening, after a day of hurried cabling and arranging, I bade my most adieu and took a train to San Francisco. In less than a month I was in Dunedin, where, however, I found that little was known of the strange cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns. Wharf-front scum was too common for special mention, although there was vague talk about one island trip whose mongrels had made, during which faint drumming and red flame were noted on the distant hills. In Auckland I learned that Johansen had returned with yellow hair turned white after perfunctory and inclusive questioning at Sydney, and had therefore sold his cottage on West Street and sailed with his wife to his old home in Oslo. Of a stirring experience he would tell his friends no more than he had told the Admiralty officials. All they could do was to give me his Oslo address. After I went to Sydney and talked profitously with seamen and a number of Vice Admiralty Court, I saw the Alert, now sold in commercial use as Circular Quay in Sydney Cove, but gained nothing from its non-committal bulk. The crouching image of its cuttlefish head, dragon body, and scaly wings and hieroglyphed pedestal was preserved in the museum at Hyde Park, and I had studied it long and well, finding it a thing of balefully exquisite workmanship, and with the same utter mystery, terrible antiquity, and an unearthly strangeness of material which I had noted in Lagrasse's smaller specimen. Geologists, the curator told me, had found it a monstrous puzzle, then vowed that the world held no rock like it. Then I thought with a shudder of what old Castro had told Lagrasse about the primal great ones. They had come from the stars, and had brought their images with them. Shaken from such a mental revolution as I had never before known, I now resolved to visit mate Johansen in Oslo. Sailing one autumn day, landed at the trim wharves in the shadow of the Egeberg. Johansen's address, I discovered, lay in the old town of King Harald Haradrada, which kept alive the name of Oslo during all the centuries that the greater city masqueraded as Christiania. I made up the brief trip by taxicab and knocked with palpitant heart at the door of the neat and ancient building with plastered front. A sad-faced woman in black answered my summons, and I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English that Gustav Johansen was no more. He had not survived his return, said his wife, for the things he had seen at sea in 1925 had broken him. He had told her no more than he had told the public, but he had left a long manuscript of technical matters, as he said, written in English, evidently in order to safeguard her from the peril of casual perusal. Perusal's the word. During a walk through the narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of 2 papers falling from the attic window had knocked him down. 2 Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead. Physicians found no more adequate cause for the end, and it laid to heart trouble for a weakened constitution. I now felt gnawing at my vitals that dark terror which will never leave me, till I, too, am at rest, accidentally or otherwise. Persuading the widow that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient to entitle me to his manuscript, I bore the document away and began to read it on the London boat. It was a simple, rambling thing, a naive sailor's effort at a post facto diary, and strove to recall day by day that last awful voyage. I cannot attempt to transcribe it verbatim, and is all the cloudiness and redundance, but I will tell its gist, enough to shew why the sound of the water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears of cotton. Johansen, thank God, did not know quite all, even though he saw the city and the thing, but I shall never sleep calmly again. When I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life, in time, and in space, and of those unhallowed blasphemies from elder scars which dream the sea, known the favored by a nightmarish cult, ready and eager to loose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to the sun and air. Johansen's voyage had begun just as he told it to the Vice-Admiralty, the Emma, and ballast had cleared the Auckland on February 20th, and he had felt the full force of that earthquake-born tempest which had must have heaved up from the sea bottom the horrors that filled men's dreams. Once more under control, the ship was making good progress, which then held up the Alert on March 22nd, and I could feel the mate's regret as he wrote of her bombardment and sinking. Of the swarthy cult fiends on the Alert, he speaks of significant horror. There was some peculiarly admirable quality. Getting tripped up here. Hey, Darren, welcome in. Thanks for popping in, bud. Yeah, hang on just a second, folks. Okay. Yeah, howdy, bud. Sip of water. I probably need it. This has been a mouthful. Yeah, Darren, we're reading The Call of Cthulhu tonight. I'm near the end of it. The professor is reading the notes of the sailor who ran into the Cthulhu himself, which is like this giant elder god of terror. It's what the whole universe is like based off of, and now we're reading through the notes of a madman in his final days. Okay, restart that. Johansen's voyage had begun just as he told it to the Vice-Admiralty. The Emma and ballast had cleared Auckland on February 20th, and he had felt the full force of the earthquake-born tempest, which must have heaved up from the sea bottom the horrors that filled men's dreams. Once more, under control, the ship was making good progress when held up by the Alert on March 22nd, and I could feel the mate's regret as it wrote of her bombardment and sinking. Of the swarthy cult fiends on the Alert, he speaks of significant horror. There are some peculiarly abominable quality which about them made the destruction seem almost a duty. In Johansen's shoes, an ingenious wonder at the charge of ruthlessness brought against his party during the proceedings of the court of inquiry, then driven ahead by curiosity in their captured yacht under Johansen's command, the men sight a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea, and in south latitude 47.9, west longitude 126.43, come upon a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing in the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare city of R'lyeh, that was built in measureless eons behind history up by the vast loathsome shapes that seep down from the dark stars. There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, hidden in dark, green, slimy vaults, and sending out the last after cycles incalculable, the thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive, and called impersonally to the faithful to come on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. All this Johansen did not suspect, but God knows he soon saw enough. Are you planning on reading books often? I love listening to people read a story. Yeah, I'm planning on doing this every weekend or so. I know it's Friday now, but make Saturday like my game day and Sunday my book day. I think my last message before I shut up and listen. No, man, I like having people chat with me. It's part of the gig here. But I think the next story I'm going to read after this one's either going to be a Dorian Gray or Dracula, both like 18th century horror novels. I haven't made up my mind which one yet. I may take a sip of water before I get into the next one, because we're about to get into the peak of the bullshit here. Sunday book day should be nice. Could listen to get house stuff done. Yeah, it's like, I like to do these horror stories like real late at night, since it's like spooky time, but more innocent stories I could do like earlier in the day, so that would be good for later on. Okay, back to the story, folks. I suppose that only a single mountain top, the hideous monolith-crowded citadel whereon great Cthulhu was buried, actually emerged from the waters. When I think of the extent of all that may brooding down there, I almost wish to kill myself forthwith. Johansen and his men were awed by the cosmic majesty of this dripping Babylon and elder daemons, and must have guessed without guidance that it was nothing of this or of any sane planet. Awe at the unbelievable size of the greenish stone blocks, and at the dizzying height of the great carven monolith, and at the stupefying identity of the colossal statue and bas-reliefs of the queer image found in the shrine on the alert, is poignantly visible in every line of the mate's frighteningly description. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansen achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city, for indeed of describing any definite sculpture or building, he dwells only on broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces too great to belong on anything right or proper for this earth, and impious of horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mention his talk with angles because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He had told me that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, not Euclidean. Big word. Euclidean. So there you go. And loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now an unestered seaman felt the same thing while gazing at the terrible reality. Johansen and his men landed at the sloping mud bank on this monstrous acropolis, and clambered slipperingly up over tight and oozy blocks which could have been no mortal staircase. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling out from the sea-soaked perversion, and twisted menace and suspense lurked leeringly in those crazily elusive angles of carven rock where a second glance shewed cavity after the first shewed convexity. Thanks for that shout out, B-Cops, to Darren. He deserves it. Everybody give Darren a follow. He's like one of the nicest people on Twitch. Something after like fright had come over the explorers before anything more definite than rock and ooze and weed was seen. Each would have fled had he not feared the scorn of the others, and it was only half-heartedly that they searched, vainly as it proved, for some portable souvenir to bear away. It was Rodriguez, the Portuguese, who climbed up the foot of the monolith and shouted of what he had found. The rest followed him, and looked curiously at the immense carved door, which the now familiar squid-dragon bas-relief. It was Johansen said in a great a great barn door, and they felt it was a door because the ornate lintel, threshold, and jambs around it, though they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trap door or slantwise like an outside cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground was horizontal, hence the relative position of everything else seemed fantastically variable. Bryden pushed at the stone in several places without result. Then Donovan felt over it delicately around the edge, pressing each point separately as he went. He climbed interminably around the grotesque stone molding that one would call it climbing if the thing was not after all horizontal, and the men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. Then very softly and slowly the great acre panel began to give inward at the top, and they saw that it was balanced. Donovan slid, or somehow propelled himself, down or along the jamb, and rejoined his fellows, and everyone watched the queer recession of the monstrously carven portal, and this fantasy of prismatic distortion it moved anomaly in a diagonal way, so that all the rules of matter and perspective became upset. The aperture was black, of a darkness almost material. That tenebrousness was indeed a positive quality, for it obscured such parts of the inner wall as thought to have been revealed, and actually burst forth like smoke from its aeon-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it was slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky on flapping menobranous wings. The odor arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought he had heard a nasty, slopping sound down there. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening still when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air that the poisoned city of madness. Poor Johansen's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote of this, of the 6 men who never reached the ship. He thinks 2 perished of pure fright in that accursed instant. The thing cannot be described. There is no language of such abysms of the shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God! What wonder that across the earth a great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in that telepathic instant? The thing of the idols, the green, sticky spawn of the stars, had awakened to claim his own. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigilantations of years, great Cthulhu was loose again, and ravening for delight. 3 men were swept up by its flabby claws before anybody turned. God rest them, if there be any rest in the universe. They were Donovan, Guerrera, and Angstrom. Parker slipped as the other 3 were plunging frenziedly over the endless vistas of the green-crusted rock to the boat, and Johansen swears he was swallowed up by an angle of the masonry which shouldn't have been there, an angle which was acute, but behaved as if it was obtuse. So only Bryden and Johansen reached the boat, and pulled desperately for the Alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones and hesitated flounderingly towards the edge of the water. Steam had not been suffered to go down entirely. Despite the departure of all hands on the shore, it was the work of only a few moments of feverish rushing up and down, the down beneath wheel and engines to get the Alert under way. Slowly, amidst the distorted horrors of that indescribable scene, she began to churn the lethal waters, while in the masonry of the charnel shore that was not of earth, the Titan thing from the stars slavered and gibbered like the Olympheme cursing the fleeing ship of the Odysseus. Then bolder than the storied Cyclops, great Cthulhu slid greasily into the water, and began to pursue with vast wave-raising strokes of cosmic potency. Bryden looked back and went mad, laughing shrilly as he went on laughing at intervals till death found him one night in the cabin while Johansen was wandering deliriously. But Johansen had not given out yet. Knowing that the thing could surely overtake the Alert until steam was fully up, he resolved on a desperate chance, and setting the engine for full speed, ran lightning-like on deck and reversed the wheel. There was the mighty eddying and the foaming and the noisome brine, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, the brave Norwegian drove his vessel head-on against the pursuing jelly, which rose above the unclean froth like the stern of a Damon galleon. The awful squid head with the writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansen drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 open graves, and a sound of the chronicler would not put on paper. For an instant the ship was befouled by an acrid and blinding green cloud, and there was only a venomous seething astern, where, God in heaven, a seeming plasticity of that nameless sky spawn, inecrously recombining in its hateful original form, while its distance widened every second as the Alert gained impetus from its mountaining steam. That was all. After that Johansen only brooded over the idol in the cabin, and attended to a few matters of food for himself and the laughing maniac by his side. He did not try to navigate after the first bold flight, for the reaction had taken something out of his soul. Then came the storm of April 2nd, and a gathering of clouds about his consciousness. There is a sense of spectral whirling through liquid gulfs and infinity, a dizzying rise through a reeling universes on a comet's tail, and a hysterical plunges from the pit to the moon and from the moon back again to the pit, all livened by the achinating chorus of the distorted, hilarious elder gods and the green bat-winged mocking imps of Tartarus. Out of that dream came rescue, the Vigilant, the Vice-Admiralty Court, the streets of Dunedin, and the long voyage back home to the old house by the Edinburgh. He could not tell. They would think him mad. He would write of what he knew before death came, but his wife must not guess. Death would be a boon if only it could blot out the memories. That was the document I had read, and now I have placed it inside a box beside the bas-relief and the papers of Professor Agnell, and with it shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that I hope may never be pieced again. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterwards be poison to me. I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansen went, and so I shall go. I know too much, and the cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, again in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. As a cursed city is sunken once more, for the Vigilant sailed over the spot after the April storm, but his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay around idol-capped monoliths and lonely places. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think. Let me pray that if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity, and see that it meets no other eye. And that, my friends, is the end of the Call of Cthulhu. Oh man, that was a lot. So yeah, the end there. Captain Johansen, in one last ditch effort, put his great steamboat in reverse and rammed Cthulhu's toe so hard the ancient eldritch horror went back to fucking bed. What a story. What a story. Thanks everybody for coming around. Got a whole big list of thank yous to make this time. Thank you, Inuyasha and the B-Cops for sticking around since the start. Thank you, Darren, for popping in. B with the rate of 7. Morgan popping in. Means a lot, fellas. Juicy J for resubbing. Yeah, guys, this seriously has been just such a blessing on my life the last few weeks, and you really don't know what it means to me. I wish words could describe it, but it means a whole lot, and I love each and every one of you. I'll be back tomorrow with some more Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. It's a fairly short game, so I think I'm near the end. It's like I may have like another third or so to go, but I figure I can hammer it out in one stream. And depending on the mood, Sunday, I may either be streaming more like another book, probably Dracula or The Picture of Dorian Gray, both 18th century or 19th century horror novels. I figured Dracula's would probably be the more popular pick. Or I'll probably, if I'm not doing that, I'll stream another game or something. But either way, folks, I hope you all have a very wonderful night. And remember, Cthulhu waits in your dreams. For now, let me see who I can raid. Super Nerd's still on. He's a real nice guy. He's a friend of Trips. He's currently playing The Forest, which is a horror game, which kind of fits the atmosphere of this stream. What a story, Mark. I did not hit her. I did not. Okay, Okay. Raid channel. There's a book you should read next. I don't have the book, but I should read it. Maybe after Halloween, just for you, B Cops, I'll read it. The Disaster Artist. I've watched the movie, though. I liked it a lot. Yeah, we'll read Super Nerd. Boop. Dude, the book is way better. I'd say so, because, like, every chance you get, they're like, is there a celebrity you'd like to interview? It's always Tommy Wiseau. And, like, can't blame you. He's insane. He's a beautiful, insane man. Like, somehow makes shitloads of money off of God knows what. But, yeah, everybody. Thanks for popping in. Thanks for listening to this goober read a cozy, scary story, and I hope you all have a good night. Peace out.